James Hillman did not want to make Jung easier. He wanted to make him less comfortable. That is why Hillman is such a dangerous figure in the Jungian family. He does not simply repeat the old vocabulary, shadow, anima, dream, symbol, self. He walks into that language and asks whether even Jungians have become too eager to turn the soul into a system. The modern person arrives in psychology with a familiar request: fix my anxiety, heal my wound, remove my anger, explain my dreams. Tell me what this pattern means so I can finally get rid of it. And of course, sometimes people do need help. Sometimes suffering is not poetic. Sometimes it is severe, practical, urgent, and physical. Hillman was not asking anyone to worship pain, but he noticed something that still matters. The moment we call every inner difficulty a problem to solve, we quietly decide that the soul is supposed to be efficient, clean, adjusted, and understandable. That assumption may be the real illness. Hillman came out of the Jungian world, but he became one of its great rebels. He trained at the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, later directed studies there, and then helped create what became known as archetypal psychology. His major book, Revisioning Psychology, appeared in 1975. The title matters. He was not trying to add one more technique, he wanted psychology to see again. For Jung, the psyche was not just a machine producing symptoms. Dreams were not random noise. Myths were not primitive mistakes. Fantasies were not meaningless distractions. They were expressions of a deeper symbolic life. Hillman accepted that inheritance, but then he pushed it further. He thought psychology had become too literal. Too hungry to explain, too quick to translate every image into a concept the ego could manage. A snake in a dream becomes sexuality, a house becomes the self, a storm becomes emotion, a wound becomes trauma, a god becomes an archetype. The living image is captured, labeled, and filed away. Hillman objected to that move, not because interpretation is always wrong, but because interpretation can become a kind of violence. It can take a strange image from the depths and force it to speak the language of the conscious mind. Imagine someone dreams of a black dog waiting outside a locked church. A conventional interpretation might ask what the dog represents: instinct, loyalty, depression, the shadow. Then the church may become religion, conscience, tradition, the old moral order. Some of that might be useful, but Hillman would slow the whole operation down. He would ask us to stay with the image. What kind of dog? Waiting how? Threatening, patient, hungry, abandoned? What kind of church? Stone, wooden, ruined, modern, empty? Why outside? Why locked? What mood lives in the scene before we explain it? The difference is subtle but enormous. One approach says, decode the dream so the ego can use it. Hillman says, let the dream restore the imagination. This is where his rebellion begins. Jung often described individuation as a movement toward wholeness, toward a more complete relation between ego and self. Hillman worried that even wholeness could become another heroic project, another ladder, another spiritual career for the ego. The ego says, I will integrate my shadow. I will become whole. I will complete myself. Hillman hears the ambition in that sentence. He asks whether the psyche is really asking to be unified by the ego, or whether it is asking to be recognized in its many voices. Not one final self that organizes everything into harmony, but many images, moods, gods, figures, and patterns moving through a life. This is why Hillman often sounds polytheistic. He does not mean that everyone must believe in literal gods. He means that the psyche is plural. It does not speak with one voice. It comes as grief, rage, eros, ambition, dread, beauty, envy, devotion, memory, and fantasy. Each has its own face. Modern self-help often treats these faces as obstacles. Hillman treats them as visitors. If these hidden rooms of Jungian psychology interest you, keep this channel close. Hillman is only the first door. The people after Jung made the house much stranger. To understand how radical this is, think about sadness. The usual question is, how do I stop feeling sad? A Hillmanian question might be, what image is sadness trying to bring? What kind of world does sadness reveal? What does it make visible that optimism refuses to see? Again, this does not mean sadness should be romanticized. It does not mean depression should be ignored. It means that the soul is not honored when every dark mood is immediately treated as defective weather. There are kinds of sorrow that know things. There are kinds of anger that guard a boundary. There are fantasies that reveal what a life has exiled. There are symptoms that may be destructive, but still meaningful. Hillman's word for this deeper field was soul. Not soul as a religious possession, not soul as a vague spiritual glow. Soul, for Hillman, is the dimension of depth, image, metaphor, and meaning that makes a life more than behavior. A psychology without soul can still measure, classify, and treat, but it may lose the very thing that made psychology necessary in the first place. This is why Hillman could be so critical of therapeutic culture. He saw how easily therapy becomes adaptation. The person is helped to function, to communicate better, to manage emotions, to return to productivity. Those things can matter. But Hillman asks a more disturbing question. What if the goal of the symptom is not simply to return you to the life that produced it? What if the breakdown is also an image of a life that has become too small? What if the anxiety is not only a malfunction, but also a protest against a false identity? What if the fantasy you keep dismissing is not childish escape, but a doorway into the unlived pattern of your character? This is where Hillman meets his most popular idea, the acorn theory from the Soul's Code. He suggests that a life may carry an image of calling, a daimon, a pattern that is not reducible to family, society, or conscious choice. This idea is attractive and it can be misused. People can turn it into destiny talk, as if every impulse is sacred and every inconvenience is a sign. Hillman is more subtle than that. He is trying to defend the mystery of character against a culture that explains everyone only by biography, trauma, economics, or brain chemistry. He asks us to imagine that a life has an image inside it. Not a fixed career plan, not a motivational slogan, an image. And images do not behave like instructions. They haunt, they return, they distort a life until they are noticed. This is why Hillman is not easy comfort. He does not say, discover your calling and everything will feel better. He says the soul may speak through the very disturbances you were trying to erase. A person may spend years trying to become calm, ordinary, and acceptable when the deeper image in the life is wild, artistic, solitary, priestly, erotic, or severe. The symptom may be tangled with avoidance, but also with refusal. The psyche refuses the official story. Jung would have understood part of this. Jung's entire psychology depends on the idea that the unconscious compensates the conscious attitude. If the conscious personality is too narrow, dreams and symptoms may bring what was excluded. Hillman agrees, but he does not want to rush compensation into correction. He wants the image to remain strange long enough to change the way we see. This is the midpoint twist. Hillman is not saying that suffering is good. He is saying that our first interpretation of suffering is often too shallow. When a person says, I want to get rid of this part of myself, Hillman might ask, who taught you that this part had no soul? When someone says, I keep having the same dream, he might ask, have you actually looked at it, or have you only tried to solve it? When someone says, I need to become whole, he might ask, which voices are you planning to silence in the name of wholeness? That question is uncomfortable because it turns the therapeutic project around. The ego walks into the room asking for tools. Hillman asks whether the ego itself is the thing holding the tools too tightly. Still, Hillman's rebellion needs Jung beside it. Without Jung, Hillman can become too aesthetic, too enchanted with images, too willing to let beauty replace confrontation. Jung keeps the work grounded in psychic conflict. Jung reminds us that the unconscious is not a museum of symbols. It can possess, inflate, deceive, and overwhelm. Hillman protects Jung from becoming a repair manual. Jung protects Hillman from becoming a poetry of avoidance. Together, they create a harder psychology. One that does not reduce the psyche to symptoms, but also does not pretend every symptom is wisdom. One that listens to dreams, but does not flatten them into slogans. One that respects the soul, but does not let the ego decorate itself with depth. This matters now because the internet has turned inner life into content. Shadow work becomes a checklist. Archetypes become personality brands. Healing becomes an identity. Even dreams become quick messages from the universe. Hillman would distrust the speed of all this. He would ask what happens to the soul when every image has to become useful. The psyche may not want to be useful at first. It may want to be accurate. It may want to show the poverty of your current language. It may want to make a scene, not because scenes are mature, but because the polite version of your life has stopped telling the truth. If this way of reading the psyche is useful, stay with me. The next post-Jungians turn dreams, myths, and midlife crises into maps most textbooks leave flat. So what do we do with Hillman? We do not turn him into a guru. That would betray him immediately. We do not use him as an excuse to avoid change. We do not say, "My wound is my soul," and then refuse responsibility. We take from him a discipline of seeing. Before you fix the image, look at it. Before you explain the mood, describe its world. Before you turn the dream into advice, ask what the dream is doing as an image. Before you call a part of yourself broken, ask what myth it belongs to. This is not passive. It may be harder than action. The ego loves action because action makes it feel central. Looking requires humility. It admits that the psyche may know something before the conscious mind knows how to use it. Hillman went beyond Jung by refusing to let even Jungian psychology become too heroic. He took Jung's symbolic imagination and made it less obedient to the project of self-improvement. Jung opened the door to the unconscious. Hillman walked in and found not one royal road to wholeness, but a city of images. Some were ugly, some were beautiful, some were ancient, some were embarrassing. Some looked like symptoms, some looked like gods. Some looked like failures that had been waiting for a better name. And perhaps that is Hillman's most useful warning. The soul does not always arrive as peace. Sometimes it arrives as the image you keep trying to delete. The task is not to kneel before it. The task is not to obey it blindly. The task is to stop standing over it with tools long enough to see what has actually appeared. Because a psyche that is only repaired may become functional, but a psyche that is seen may become deep.